I'm going to do some quick introductions and we'll get started and everything. My name is Christina Yao. I'm at the University of South Carolina. I am one of the co-chairs for the CIHE pre-conference and also vice chair for CIHE this year. We put this together as a way to answer questions, to talk about give some advice, and mostly to answer a lot of questions that you may have about submitting to the conference and everything. And we also, we're really excited that we can partner with our colleagues who are also the co-chairs for the international section of the General ASHE conference, because I know there's always a lot of questions about what's the difference and which one should I submit to and everything. And we will try to get an answer to you. Cindy, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself real quick on behalf of the ASHE office.
Hi, everyone. Cindy Brewster, she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Conference and Events for ASHE. I've been with the association for about 7 months now. And I have been working hard on the call for proposals, and I'm really kind of getting folks energized around the 2022 conference. So I'm here to really assist if folks have questions or just kind of some of those logistical pieces around the conference and submitting over the next 2.5 weeks.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so what we're doing today, we do have some slides that we're going to go through with all of you, but our goal is to open it up mostly for a lot of questions and answers for, so that way we can target some of the specific things that you have questions about, but we want to go through a few of the more common things that we get. So I'm going to start, well, of course I click and then it doesn't go. All right. Starting off with, this is hosted by the Council for International Higher Education. This is a quick list of our executive committee, and a quick plug is that we love for you to join our community. You know, we have a lot of benefits as far as you get a discount with our pre-conference. We send out bi-monthly newsletters. We have several networking and social events and webinars and just making those connections. But if you also want to get involved even more, we also encourage you to get involved with some of these leadership opportunities that we have available. So this year we are seeking a new member at large, a communications coordinator, and a graduate student liaison. And I created a very large QR code in the corner. So if you are interested in getting a little more information about these opportunities, please go ahead and scan that, and it'll take you right to the ASHE page, which talks about the elections process and everything, and the nominations process. And of course, if you have questions about that, feel free to shoot me an email. I am on the committee, so I'm happy to chat with you about that as well. All right, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jeongeun to introduce herself real quick.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. It's great to see you here. My name is Jeongeun Kim. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University, and this year serving as co-chair of the CIHE PreCon with Christina. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation today, and please feel free to ask us any questions that you might have with the submission process. Thanks.
And just an FYI, this is actually literally a screenshot from the call for proposals, everyone. Okay, so we just pulled it just to kind of highlight what's in our section, but please feel free to go to the call for proposal. There's going to be more information about some of these. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Kayla.
Hey, thanks, Christina. Hey, everybody. My name is Kayla Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. And I have the uber pleasure of being the section co-chair of international higher education with Melissa Whatley.
I think that's my cue to introduce myself. So I'm Melissa Whatley. I'm an assistant professor at the School for International Training's Graduate Institute, and I am co-chair for the International Higher Education section of the regular ASHE conference this year. So we wanted to talk, just very briefly mention that there are several different kinds of formats that you can submit a proposal in for the ASHE conference. We're probably all most familiar with the first one that's listed there on the screen, the research paper format, which is a description of an empirical study. And then reviewers evaluate that proposal based on its connection to the literature, theoretical framework, the research plan, and the significance of the work. But there's actually 5 other kinds of proposal formats that you can submit in. The next one is a scholarly paper. And this is an argumentative paper. It poses and grapples with critical questions in the field. It synthesizes literature, or it elaborates on a new theoretical or conceptual framework. That one at the bottom of the screen, the third kind, is an interactive symposium. Those sessions are 75 minutes. And the goal there is exactly what the title suggests, is for there to be interaction among both the presenters and the audience to discuss a key problem, theory, issue in the field of higher education. The fourth format, so the first bullet point that you see here on this slide is a self-designed paper session. And that is a session, whether it's research papers or scholarly papers that all address the same topic. And when you propose a self-designed paper session, you also include a chair and a discussant that can talk about, that are experts on that particular topic. Next is a roundtable, and that is either in person or virtual for this year's ASHE conference. And this is a more informal version of a conference presentation, like the research kind of talk that you might see, or the scholarly talk. And it is intended to share more works in progress than it is a full, complete research paper, for example. And then finally, we've got the virtual posters, and that is for engagement in interactive discussion about a particular research project. So we've got the 6 formats that you can submit proposals for.
And we really, we will have some time for some questions a little bit later to get into some specific tips or tricks you might be looking for. But we came up with a couple of reminders and tips for you to think about as you're trying to choose what kind of section or what kind of presentation you want to do, as well as how to be successful in proposing something. So not posters and not virtual roundtable sessions, but all other kinds of presentations are going to be delivered in person for both the general conference and the pre-conference this year. So that's a change from last year, and I think the year before as well. So we're seeing a slight shift back to the in-person focus, but we are still trying to build in those in-person, or those virtual opportunities to keep it accessible for different folks. And again, not the interactive symposia here, but no identifying information should be included in the proposal itself. So if you're proposing an interactive symposium, the reviewers on the other side will see your name and your institution. It's just the way that the system works, but everything else should be de-identified. And then lastly, as a submitter, you will have the opportunity to indicate which format you prefer during the proposal submission process. So you can say, I prefer a research paper presentation, I prefer a roundtable, or I prefer a poster. So you can indicate your preference in those. Do we have a slide on like tips and tricks of like putting together a successful proposal, or would I be speaking out of turn if I said that? Am I good? All right. I'll cover the timeline and then like just some ideas for like how to put together a good proposal. So you can see that proposal and volunteer applications are due. It's coming up Monday, April 18th at 4 p.m. Pacific Vegas time. So all of the ASHE deadlines are in the time zone of the conference. So keep that in mind as you're planning that. You know, I think I would say like, don't wait until the last minute, but we all know that we all do that, right? So keep it on your calendar, note the time zone. And please do volunteer to be a reviewer. So I believe that email went out yesterday or today. So if you're interested in volunteering to review proposals, please indicate that. Yes, thank you for dropping that in the chat. Let's see, early May. So this is when those of us on the other end are going to assign the proposals to be reviewed. And so there'll be a 3-week window to complete those reviews. And then in early June, that's when you should find out whether you were accepted or rejected. You know, fingers crossed for acceptance. But the typical acceptance rate for the general conference is around 45%. You know, this is still one of those weird COVID years, right? So that might look a little bit different, but generally it's about 45% across the general conference. That's not necessarily true for international higher education or any particular section. I believe there are 10 sections across ASHE, 10 or 12. So each of those is going to be different. I don't know off the top of my head what the international higher ed section is, but generally 45%.
Can I add one more thing regarding the reviewers? So in terms of who are wondering like who the reviewers are, as Kayla mentioned, you will get 3 sets of reviews per your proposal. Regardless of your results on, the acceptance, you will be receiving the comments from the reviewers as well as their ratings. Who can be the reviewers? It's usually people who have terminal degrees in our field, and also who is listed as, one of the submitters on proposals. But at the same time, ASHE also welcomes doctoral candidates to be included as one of the 3 reviewers. So for those who are listening here, who are, doctoral candidates, we also encourage you to consider participating in the review process.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. I forgot to say that. That's really important information.
Can y'all also, somebody mentioned, maybe Kayla or Jeongeun, can y'all talk about, people are signing up to volunteer. They can sign up to be reviewers, but they can also sign up to be chairs and discussants. Can you mention what those are?
Sure. So when you go into the system and say, like, I want to volunteer, it'll give you some options. So do you want to volunteer for a specific section, for the PreCon? And then you'll also be asked, do you want to volunteer as a reviewer, as a chair, or as a discussant? So we talked about reviewers. So chairs are the people in each session that sort of keep things organized. They moderate the Q&A, they introduce the presenters and the papers before each presentation. And then the discussant is the person who brings it all together at the end and talks about the similarities or the connections between each paper, offers some feedback, and can also play a role in moderating that Q&A with the audience. So the discussant typically will receive the papers from the presenters about 2 weeks before the conference. And so you'll have time to read through, you'll be often the first eyes on the paper. So you'll read through, you'll help them synthesize across the papers, draw out the common themes, and give them some feedback, because a lot of them will be using that feedback to prepare their proposal for submission to a journal.
One more thing that probably people can consider is across the ASHE conference program, one person cannot appear, I think, more than 4 times, or I guess probably up to 5 times. So if you're thinking of like, okay, I'll submit X numbers of proposals, and on top of that, like if you wanted to serve as chair and discussant, you probably want to consider that. The good thing is that the PreCons are not counting towards those limitations. So that's something that you can also consider as you think about how many proposals you're submitting, and also what other service roles you might consider.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, this is everyone's warning. I'm about to stop sharing screen, which means now it's a Q&A time. All right, so this is a great time to start getting your questions together, or you can pop it in the chat, or you can also feel free to just unmute and ask any questions you might have. Or I can start with a question if nobody has anything yet. I'll start with one as y'all keep thinking, okay? My first question for the panel. So what is the difference between submitting to the CIHE pre-conference and to the general conference? Like why would I do the pre-conference versus submitting to the international section for the general conference?
I guess my response would be more about what I've enjoyed about the pre-conference. So one thing I like about the pre-conference is it really is a small community, and it's all planned over one day. And so everything feels very compact, and everybody around you is thinking about international topics. And whereas with the general conference, the international higher education section panels are spread out. And so you get those sort of micro communities or microcosms of community throughout the week and throughout the couple of days. But I think the pre-conference is a great place to come and, see your community, and can feel sometimes a little bit more intimate. And I think that differs across, across the conferences over the years, but that's generally been my experience.
Yeah, I'll also just add, for those of you who might be new to ASHE, the pre-conference does happen before the full conference, the main conference. And so if you decide that you're going to submit to the pre-conference and that that's what you're interested in, that does mean potentially extra expense in terms of travel costs. It's an extra night at the hotel or something like that. So just something to keep in mind as you think about which options you're interested in.
Yeah, I just repeat what Kayla said. The pre-con, it's more, like intense discussions around like, people who are active in the scholarship of, like CIHE community. So I guess, like some of the feedback you will receive and also the Q&As and the discussions like afterwards are, like more, focused, and you can probably get, like useful feedback, I think, in terms of like moving the project forward for like, publications, if the journal will be something more like aligned with the, specific international and comparative higher education, field. So I guess that has been, something that I enjoyed mostly going to the pre-con. And I guess for the reasons that Melissa was mentioning, there might be some times that people who are, in this community are coming more likely, like to come to pre-con, and maybe as the conference dates are passing, people start leaving. So, let's say if your presentation was like on the last day of the general conference, then, maybe there will be like less of the people who are actually doing and engaging with the work. So I guess that was also like another experience of mine, at least, kind of as a benefit of like going to pre-con, or the differences between the two.
And then I would say on the flip side, because I think we've said a lot of good things about the pre-con, and I want you all to submit to the International Higher Ed section too, right? I think on the flip side, that one benefit of submitting to the general conference, but to the International Higher Ed section, is that you're more likely to get sort of non-specialists in the room to listen to your presentation. So the pre-conference is limited to only people who register for the pre-conference. So people kind of self-select whether they're going to engage with that research. And it's the same way as people are choosing which panels to go to during the general conference. But because the general conference, you can go to any section, any section's panels throughout the week, you're more likely to find people who don't always engage with international higher ed, or maybe some new people that you haven't engaged with or haven't seen your work before. And so I think it increases your visibility in just a different kind of way.
Okay, questions from the audience? Don't be shy. There's a reason why y'all came to this.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi. Thank you for this panel. It's very, very helpful. My name is Shinji. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa. So my questions, sorry, actually I missed a little bit first few minutes. So like probably you explained that, but would you mind to explain a little bit more about the evaluation, like, review points? Like, is there any kind of rubric, something, we can look at? Because, as a graduate student, when we are writing a those proposal, like something, yeah, am I writing the right thing? So especially like, if like this CIHE has some a little bit different like evaluation point from the general conference, it's going to be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Jeongeun, do you want to take this first?
Sure. So I like, to my understanding, I think there would be, like if you volunteer as reviewer, right? Like let's kind of imagine like what you are facing, like when you go into the interface system. So it'll be like, someone's proposal submitted, and there would be like review guidelines, basically saying, okay, here are some criteria that you can look into. And so, it'll be usually in the format of a rating. And I guess those criteria includes like clarity of the study topic, idea, and also like the significance of the study, and also like how well the proposal is covering like what has been studied before, which probably falls into the areas of like literature review, the appropriateness of the conceptual framework that was employed for the study, and also clarity in the alignment between the research questions and the methods, right? Like to answer to the research question and achieve the purpose. So I think those are some of the criteria that the reviewers get to evaluate each proposal, which will usually like, take the scale of like 5 and how you evaluate how well this proposal address each part. But also there will be, like open-ended boxes where the reviewers are actually providing some written, feedback for each proposal, like what is done well, and like what might be some areas that they have questions for clarity or suggestions for improvement. So I think those will be the information that the reviewers will provide, which I think you can also then think about, okay, like, if I was reviewer evaluating this proposal, like what can I do to better communicate the intention of the study and what has been conducted and the significance of it.
Melissa?
Yeah, I'll also add, so if you look at the call for proposals in the PDF document starting on around page 37, 38, it actually, so each submission type provides a lot more detail than what I just went over very briefly in the presentation, and it has the review criteria for each submission type. And this leads into perhaps our tips about how to write a good proposal. Use the criteria as your headers in your proposal. So like I'm looking at, for example, on my screen right now, I have the research paper proposal, the criteria for which they will be evaluated. And so there's significance and contribution, quality of theoretical or conceptual framework, connection to literature, the discussion of the paradigm, methodology, methods, etc. Next is the relevance of the findings, and then the end is the overall clarity of the proposal. So those first 5 bullet points, if I were writing this proposal, I would use those as the headers. That way reviewers don't have to find your theoretical framework because you've told them where it is.
And one thing, so specific to some of those points that you two just brought up, I've seen a lot of like reviewer feedback that has been critical of like the absence of a framework or not having a clear framework. And so, some of us who are like grounded theorists, for example, might not have a framework, but then it's important for us to communicate why we don't have a framework. And so if you feel that your work is falling under that, just be clear about what you have and what you don't and justify it. So yes, agree, like use the clear signposting. Don't make people hunt for the different pieces that need to be in your proposal, but also acknowledge when you just don't have a piece. And generally that's going to be the framework. I think you should be able to have all the other pieces. But if you don't have a framework, just articulate that and say why, or why that's appropriate given your particular methodology. Another one that I see a lot of reviewer feedback comment on is the lack of articulating how your research is significant for the broader ASHE community or for the CIHE community specifically. Like, why should we care about research in X location or research about X population or research around X issue? And that's not unique to international work, but I do see it happening a lot more in international, in the feedback on international proposals is like, we tend to think in our own context. And so like, I do a lot of work in Peru, and I always get a lot of feedback of, well, why is work in Peru relevant for people in the US or people in Mexico or whatever? And sometimes the answer is, well, it's not directly relevant, but it's transferable. So if you can talk about some of those transferable elements of like the connections to the broader field, I think you'll have you'll have greater success with some of those more critical reviewers who are sort of context bound. And that, because that happens, right? That's what I had.
Yep, and Cindy also posted in the chat that there's example proposals on the website, and so there's a direct link to that. But I mean, I agree with everything that everybody said. No matter what, the reviewers are looking for every single element that's out in the call for proposals. So, and you're exactly right, Kayla. The theoretical framework, that one, like it's not sufficient to say I don't have a theoretical framework. It's more like I don't have a theoretical framework and this is why, because the quantitative aspect of it, I mean, I think it's from 1 to 5. And so if you just say, I don't have one, they're like, well, I can't give you a 5 on that. They're like 1. And then automatically that's already getting your average down, which is unfortunate. But for some reviewers, they're not really paying attention, or they're not looking, and they're like, well, if you don't have one, it's automatically a 1. And so that could harm you a little bit in that quantitative piece.
That's very helpful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. And somebody feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that for ASHE proposals, you're expected to have a more or less finished study. So it's not really sufficient to say like, my study's still in progress, but I'll have my findings by November. I think you're more expected to have some kind of completed product or some kind of anticipated findings to be able to report in the proposal. At least the ones that I see that are more successful tend to have those findings that they can talk about.
I think anticipated, right? And you can actually put that on the header. It's like your preliminary findings and making it clear that you're still working on it, but that you've already collected the data. I think that at a minimum is what you need to do, because there are people who've given feedback and said, oh, I don't think they're going to finish this project in time for the conference. Like, okay, right? So we go with what the reviewers say, right? We have to respect what the review process is. All right. Other questions from the audience? Okay, so I have a question that Laura typed in. If our project is currently ongoing, then would you suggest we wait until the next year? Who wants to take that first?
I can take it first. I think my answer would be very similar to what we just said, is that you want to demonstrate that the project will be finished by the time of the ASHE conference. And one way to do that is to demonstrate that you've collected the data, that you have the data that you would need to complete the project. So, you know, I suppose it depends on what you mean by your project being ongoing. Do you have some of the data and the rest is going to be available shortly after the proposal deadline, or have you yet to start data collection? But, you know, what you want to be able to do is demonstrate to reviewers that this project is feasible within the timeline. I don't know if others have things to add as well.
I add something to like what Melissa said. I think it also depends on like what scale you mean by the project. Like if it's really huge project that has like multiple elements, and if you wanted say, oh, you know, like at least this part of like data collection or analysis is done, and I kind of want to get feedback from the reviewers, you know, like on this element, and maybe like, you know, in terms of the way that we can expand on this part, or like, you know, rethinking the way that we look at the data. I think that's probably something that you can also mention, that like, oh, this is like, you know, big part of like, you know, this big project, but you know, in this particular study, like we focus on this aspect. So, you know, when we talk about the possibility of like completing and be prepared for the conference in November, we basically think that like, okay, can I complete a whole paper or manuscript, you know, that is somewhat developed by the time, with like, you know, consistent content like across the sections that we can think of, like, you know, in typical sense. So that would be something that I would consider, that like, oh, you know, this is big project and some part is done, then I would say maybe you can create a manuscript and submit it.
And I'll just add too that, and we mentioned this earlier, that you could also think about doing a roundtable. So roundtables aren't for, you know, aren't for those projects that are incomplete. But if you have some ideas that are formulating based on what you've done so far, you might want to consider a roundtable, because again, those are the places where you can get more active feedback and test out ideas. So maybe you just want to try that kind of format.
Right. I have another question in the chat. So any recommendations or tips for balancing the number of proposals to submit and volunteering as a chair/discussant? So basically, how do y'all balance that out, right? As far as your involvement in ASHE at the conference?
It's a good question. And I could tell you from personal experience what not to do. And that is don't aim to have your name on the program more times than you are able to stretch yourself, I suppose, would be the answer. So, you know, one year when I was a doctoral student, I didn't expect to be as successful as I was on the proposals that I submitted. And I ended up having 3 or 4 presentations. And then I was chairing a couple sessions. And I don't know how my name got on the program that many times, because I don't think it was supposed to happen. Don't stretch yourself that thin. So keep in mind, you know, what other projects you have going on, what other responsibilities you have, and submit what you can reasonably do. Don't feel like you have to aim for the maximum. So my 2 cents based on personal experience.
Kayla or Jeongeun, any feedback? Okay. Yep, Jeongeun.
No, I was just going to say that it also depends on like how, you know, how much progress you already have made on your papers, for example, right? Like, you know, is it something that like you were close to finish the manuscripts and like always left is preparing for presentation versus like you need to have manuscripts written for every single proposals that you are submitting, which will be, I think, a lot of work considering, you know, like the timelines. I think you can actually look at the timelines in the call for proposal that you are expected to submit the full proposal, especially for the research paper sections, for example. So also consider the time even before the conferences to meet the expectations for like submitting the full paper on by the deadline to the chair, discussant, and etc.
I will say though, in defense of volunteering for things, I feel like we've given you a lot of reasons now, like why not to volunteer. Chairing a session, if you're, you know, a graduate student and, you know, you're thinking in the next year or two, you might go on the job market and you need to start getting to know people and you need people to start recognizing your name. Chairing a session is a great way to do that. That does not involve writing a full conference paper.
And we haven't really talked much about being a discussant, but you know, going back to what that discussant role looks like is you're going to be getting the papers from, you know, all of the authors a couple weeks before, and then you have to read them, you have to synthesize, you have to provide feedback, you have to prepare something to talk about. So it's not a light load, it's not a light lift at all, but it is incredibly rewarding because again, you are often the first set of eyes on these manuscripts, and you know, you have the floor when other people are in the room after the presentations, and then people really do listen to those discussing comments. And so I think, again, if you are sort of on the job market or if you want that developmental opportunity, being a discussant is a really, really great way to stay connected and get really engaged in the scholarship that's happening.
I think, if you want to be a discussant, you have to have a terminal degree though, right? Is that?
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
All right, well, then forget everything I said. But if you have a terminal degree, if you have a terminal degree, then it's really
right. But still, I think as a, you know, early career, you know, person, you know, like who finished their like, you know, terminal degrees like recently, I think that's really a good, you know, developmental opportunity as Kayla put it. So please consider volunteering.
Yeah, I think we're always looking for discussants, right? I mean, it's a really important role and it is hard. I mean, like Kayla said, I mean, basically as a discussant, you're sitting there basically doing like 3 or 4 manuscript review all in a few weeks and everything, right? And so it is rewarding, but it is a lot of work. And I think definitely, you know, trying to balance out, you know, how many proposals you want to submit with what other things you want to do, right? Because you might be involved, there might be meetings you want to go to, there might be other sessions that you want to go to. And also if you're in the job market, like you want to make sure that you have time to, you know, if you're meeting with people or to have conversations and everything like that. And so a lot of it's just kind of what you want to get out of the conference and what you're looking for and what stage of your career. So there's a question here. We can only submit our proposal to one type of proposal. Yes, but can somebody walk through exactly when you submit? And, you know, if I'm like, okay, I'm going to submit for a research paper, but do I have other options to say I could do other types of papers and stuff? Can you walk me through that a little bit? Anyone? I see Melissa kind of.
It's been about a year since I've submitted an ASHE proposal, so I can tell you what I remember. So when you log into the system to submit a proposal, there's a number of choices that you have to make about what kind of proposal you're submitting. And I don't remember what order they come in, but essentially you'll answer questions about what kind of proposal is it? So is this a research paper? Is this a scholarly paper? Is this a roundtable, et cetera? You will also select the section of the conference that you are submitting to, and the pre-conferences are one of those choices that you make. So you can only submit to, so if you have a proposal that's international focused, you can submit it to the pre-conference or you can submit it to the main conference. You can't submit to both. And then there's also a place where you can indicate that if my preferred choice for this paper is not selected, right? So say you submit a research paper, you can indicate if I don't get accepted as a research paper, then I would be happy to do this as a roundtable, or I would be okay to do a poster or something like that. So you can have second and third choice formats. Was that the question, more or less?
Yep, exactly. And I think that's always a good option. To be honest, I think that's a good option to check. right? If you submit for a research paper that if it's not accepted as a research paper, I think it's great to say, yes, I'm willing to do a roundtable or willing to do a poster, because no matter what, if your goal is to get into the conference and be able to have these conversations with people, I think it's a great, I mean, just, yeah, say, I will do whatever, right? And I'm happy to go there and present and stuff. So there's a question here. Do you recommend that first year PhD students volunteer as a proposal reviewer?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy. I guess the ASHE web page indicates that like reviewers have to have their terminal degrees or be a doctoral candidate, right? So in that case, I guess doctoral students cannot volunteer, unfortunately.
As long as they are candidates, yes, like you said, so they have to be doctoral candidates in order to serve as a reviewer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in the coming future, please volunteer. But I guess still, like I would encourage people like to submit proposal and like, understand with your experience, right? Like how this procedure works. And then maybe when you reach that point, you can volunteer to be the reviewers.
And also, yeah, and also, I'm sorry, I was gonna say, when you reach that point, remember also how great it felt when people gave you constructive and positive feedback, right? And how bad it feels when people give you very negative feedback. Because I'll be honest, right? I think this is the world of anonymity, and people kind of hide behind their screens and they can say things that they might not be willing to say, in person. And I think as co-chairs, we try to filter some of that stuff out. But I'll be honest, sometimes it passes through, right? And so keep that in mind too in the future as you're doing reviews, of being kind yet constructive, I think is the best way to do it. So, all right, we have a hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jeongeun, and thank you so much for providing this space to clarify all the process and address our questions. So my question is about some logistics stuff. So I'm interested in submitting self-designed proposal, self-designed paper session. So I learned that I needed to include a chair and a discussion. So I have a few candidates, but for the chair, that person might not be. I was so for now she can attend, but maybe it depends on her job situations. She might not be able to join the conferences. So in that case, even before I getting to know the result and how should I communicate with the ASHE program chair or whatever sections that I submitted, what should I do and how should I prepare for that?
I think that's going to be a Cindy question.
Yes, I work closely with all of the discussants and chairs. So I'm actually very involved in replacements, and last year was a very unique year with our chairs and discussants. So we had a lot of wonderful folks to step in, but we also had folks that for many different reasons just couldn't fulfill the role. And so as y'all were talking earlier about like volunteering and just kind of balancing your load, I was really grateful to hear you all talk about the glamorous parts of volunteering, right? And being a chair and a discussant. So to answer your question, if someone for your self-designed session does sign up to be a chair or you select them as chair and they're not able to fulfill that requirement, you would just let me know. I'll put my email in the chat. You can also just always email conference@ashe.ws, which is my secondary email. And what I would ask in kind of the spirit of paying it forward is the alternative is I can go and maybe kind of identify someone, or I can email some of the folks that are on this panel like, hey, do y'all have a recommendation based on kind of the content of the session? But if there's somebody else that you might have as a backup or somebody that would just kind of naturally fit into that space, then let me know. And I would then do the outreach to them, see if they're available and they're actually attending in person. So that's how that process would work. It's not uncommon for folks to have to kind of change their schedules based on just the reality of what we're dealing with these days.
Great, that's good to know. Then when I submit the proposal, then all the chair and discussion should also register the submit some proposal or to submit their volunteer role in the application system, or they don't have to?
Great question. So ideally, yes, they would go ahead and sign up as a volunteer. It's going to make your job a little bit easier when you're kind of navigating the system and submitting your proposal, because you can just search for their name and then they would be added to the session. So ideally, yes, you want to go ahead and encourage them just to be in the system. And that way, if they are already in the system, perhaps other folks that are submitting something related to international higher education or to the CIHE PreCon, they can then also select them to perhaps be a chair or discussant for something else, just in case maybe it doesn't work out for you. So they're still kind of in the volunteer directory, if you will. So yes, it will be helpful to have them go ahead and register.
Great, thank you so much.
I think another important takeaway from that conversation was thinking about like the feasibility of like chair, like the different roles that you're saying that you're going to be able to do. So not necessarily appointing somebody as a chair, but if you yourself are going to be volunteering, and we already talked about like, don't overload yourself, like don't create an aspirational list of roles, create a realistic one. So changes can be made, of course, when circumstances pop up, but it is a lot of work on our end to do some of those switches, especially when they happen last minute. So if you think that you are really going to be able to do that, absolutely, we'd love to have you volunteer. If you are sort of like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that, then maybe consider next year.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for saying that. That's good to know, because I was also thinking about that, me, myself, serving as a chair and I was a presenter, but I was not sure if I can do it or not. But yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe I can have myself as a backup. Thank you so much.
Okay, other questions from the audience? I'll throw a quick question out there because I think we get this question all the time. Do I have to adhere to the conference theme for my proposal?
No, you do not. So adhering to the conference theme helps us in some ways because it makes it easier to piece different sessions together, different papers into sessions, but you don't have to. So we like to have lots of different kinds of conversations at the ASHE conference. And so a lot of them will stick to the theme, but many of them will not.
I just throw one tip there though, because like we don't know. So we as like program chairs will like assign reviewers, where like we don't control like what the reviewers will say about your own proposals and what they have as conception of like how you should align your proposal with that year's like conference theme. So I think it's still useful in some way that like to think about and reflecting on like how does my work, this particular piece, connects to what we're proposing to think collectively as intellectual community at this year's ASHE. So at least probably when you talk about the significance of the study, or maybe somewhere like in the introduction where you introduce what you are studying, I think that somewhere it's kind of like a nice way to at least like throw one or two sentences to think about, okay, I know like my like at the side, maybe my work doesn't like directly talk about this this theme, but still like how does my research at least speak to or can be relevant to what we are thinking as intellectual community together. I think that's probably like one of the good practices to insert in. So you as a participant of this community, think about your contribution, but at the same time also hint or signal your reviewer that you are thinking of it. I think that's probably what matters as well. So it doesn't have to be like, yes, it's about that theme, but at the same time, like, yes, I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That's such an important point of you can never really anticipate how the reviewers are going to interpret the different evaluation criteria. So yes, if there's some tangential connection between your topic and the theme, absolutely address it, but don't force it because reviewers will be able to see through that as well. So if you're really just trying to make an argument that isn't there, it could be to your detriment. So again, I think critically about, those connections, like, is there something there? And if so, communicate that. One question. Oh, I'm sorry, Cindy. Did you want to jump in?
I was just going to add to your point, Kayla, and to your emphatic no earlier about it not being connected to the theme. I think to Christina's point, previously, there were guiding questions that were a part of the call for proposals and for each section. And I think for some folks that kind of made them want to really align their topic or their proposal with the theme. And so by the time they got to the review stage, that may have also kind of conflated some things as well. And so this year's program committee, specifically the program co-chairs, have kind of taken that out to kind of really eliminate some of that confusion. And there's a very clear statement in the call for proposals that it is not necessary to have that alignment.
This isn't a question that anybody here has asked, but it's one that I hear being asked, or at least talked about a lot. And it's, if you're doing international work, can you only submit to CIHE or to the international higher ed section? Like, are you relegated to those areas? And the answer is no. I mean, we, of course, I don't want to discourage you from submitting to us. We absolutely want to see your proposals. But I think one of the great things about ASHE is that you can submit international work to any of the other sections. So if you, students, governance, faculty issues, please do that, because it really enhances the interdisciplinarity of our field. And we need to be having these international conversations across the general conference and the pre-conferences, not just the CIHE. So don't feel like you have to submit to the two of our places. You have other options.
But we are the best. Always remember that.
But we are the best. Please submit to us, but know that you don't have to.
So any questions from the audience? Let's see. All right, I'm gonna end this with I'm gonna have our panelists think about, including Cindy, right? Because you see a lot of everything that goes on. What is the one tip that you want to give everybody in this webinar? And as y'all are thinking about that, I'm going to ask the group, one thing we're going to try to do is after the conference, maybe in probably not till like, I don't know if we're going to be able to do it in December, maybe in January, but another webinar about how do you turn your conference paper into a manuscript proposal, and possibly invite some different journal editors to pop in, especially related to if you're writing about international work, where would it go? What are they looking for? And some tips on that. Is that something that people would be interested in? You could do like a thumbs up if your video's on, or you could put something up on your whatever. Okay, hearts, thumbs up, great, love it. All right, we will do that. So, all right, so the one tip that you have for people, I'm gonna go immediately to my right and I'm gonna start with Jeongeun. What is your one tip?
I knew you were going to call me first when I was like, okay, what do I say? Okay, so I'll say, I guess, kind of going off of what Christina was suggesting for our next work, webinar. I think conference is a good opportunity for you to, like share what you have been working, and at the same time, like get intellectual like stimulation in terms of like where you can take this work to, and also thinking about like what kind of impact you want to make with your work. So I encourage everybody like to consider submitting their work, and expect to have like passionate conversations about the topical areas with the people who are coming to the conference. So yeah, I would end with that. Please submit, and looking forward to reading your proposals and meeting you in Las Vegas in November.
All right, next is Kayla.
I guess my one tip would be to go into ASHE with a plan, but don't be too rigid on yourself. Like, don't overschedule yourself. So I think about my most impactful conference experiences, like the ones where I made really meaningful connections, or I really learned something cool. It was when I went in with intention about presentations I wanted to see, who I wanted to talk to, but where I also had time to just like sit with ideas and talk with people. So absolutely do your research beforehand. See like whose presentations do I want to see? What topics am I interested in exploring? Look at all of the events that are going on and create sort of a schedule for yourself, but not a strict schedule. Make sure that you build in time for yourself to sort of sit with ideas and also have some fun.
Melissa?
Yeah, sorry for the distraction of my dog. I guess one bit of advice is to make sure the dog goes out before your webinar starts. Don't wait until after. But as far as ASHE goes, I think I gave my one big piece of advice that I always give to people earlier in the session, whereas use the proposal rating criteria as your headers in your proposal, right? So that's my one like proposal recommendation. As far as the ASHE conference itself goes, I would say, particularly if you're new to the field, so if you're a grad student or an early career scholar, don't be afraid to reach out to people and ask them if they'd be willing to have a coffee with you to talk about your ideas. I know early in my career, I reached out to people, several who are in this room with us here today. And they, were really gracious with their time, and we had coffee or dinner or lunch or something like that together. And it really, it has been incredibly helpful to my career and the way I think about my research. And typically people are going to say yes. So don't be afraid to reach out.
I'll hop in with my tip before I send it to Cindy. I have somebody or a couple of people read your proposal for you. Read over it to make sure it makes sense. It's always helpful to also to send to people who know your work, but also to people who have no idea kind of what you do, right? Who maybe aren't as familiar with your topic, because they can kind of see some of the gaps. Because remember, we do our best to try to assign reviewers who are familiar with whatever the topic area, or or if we can't, then we think methodologically how do we make those connections. But honestly, sometimes towards the end, we're like, who's left, who hasn't, who, we haven't filled up their plate with all the reviews. We just need people to review, right? So sometimes there might be reviewers who aren't as closely aligned with their topic and everything. So having an outside person who can give you some of that feedback and see what some of the gaps would be very, very helpful. So I definitely recommend that. All right, Cindy, passing it to you.
I think to wrap it up, ASHE requires a lot of its members, but members of ASHE also really, really love and are very passionate about ASHE. So it's a two-way street. And so I would say, as you're going through this process, whether you're volunteering, whether you're submitting, whether you're just attending, to kind of connect it all to the theme of the humanization of it all. Like, think about the ways that the process is humanizing you. Think about the ways that as you're just kind of navigating all of these, all of what's going on in life, right? Like, don't be afraid to bring that authenticity into your whole selves, into your proposals, and as you show up in the conference, whether virtually or in person. We recognize that we're planning things and events in really unstable times, and so don't be afraid to bring that humanity to whatever way you show up and whatever way you give to the conference this year.